Okay, so imagine two nations, Mexico and the Philippines.
Right.
They're separated by the largest, deepest ocean on the planet. I mean, thousands of miles apart.
Seemingly nothing in common?
Exactly, except for, a shared history of Spanish colonial rule. But that's a pretty broad connection.
It is, but then the geneticists step in.
And this is where it gets wild. They look at the DNA of people living in places like Guerrero, Mexico, and they find this powerful, undeniable link to the Philippines.
It's a complete paradox. How does that even happen?
That's what this deep dive is all about. We've gone through the sources for you, historical records, brand new genome studies, to really untangle this overlooked piece of history.
That's right. Our mission here is to show you exactly how the Spanish Empire, in its hunt for silver and spice, accidentally built this genetic bridge across the Pacific.
It's a story of genetic overlap that is as unexpected as it is fascinating.
It really reshapes how we think about identity in both places.
It's just a spectacular story. But before we unpack the science behind all this, just a quick moment for something we think you'll appreciate. If you enjoy these kinds of deep dives that, really make you think, be sure to check out our Mind Expansion Daily channel.
Lots more great content there.
Absolutely. And please, if you would, take a moment to like and share this deep dive. It really helps.
It does.
Also, if you're finding value in this, maybe consider buying us a cup of coffee to support the show. And let us know where you're listening from in the comments. We genuinely love hearing from you.
We really do.
Okay, let's unpack the surprising genetic story. So, to connect Manila to Acapulco, we have to start with the Spanish Empire.
Precisely. We're talking about 3 centuries of shared colonial rule. The Philippines from 1565, New Spain, which is now Mexico, much earlier.
Right, and that brought genes from Europe, from Africa into both regions, but that's just general mixing.
Exactly. That doesn't explain the specific connection we see today. That specificity comes down to one thing.
The Manila galleon trade route, this is where the story gets really interesting.
The galleon trade was this almost mythical lifeline for Spain in the Pacific. It ran for 250 years straight, from 1565 to 1815.
Wow.
Yeah. These huge ships sailed once a year between Manila and the port of Acapulco in Mexico.
And people always think about the cargo, right?
Yeah.
The Chinese silk, the spices, all of that, traded for Mexican silver.
And you've hit on the crucial detail there, the silver. But the truly significant cargo, the one that left the biological footprint we're talking about, wasn't a thing.
It was people.
It was people.
The human cargo.
So let's talk about that, because this really challenges the typical story of colonial migration. Europeans and enslaved Africans crossing the Atlantic.
This was a whole other flow. On those galleons, you had the crew, merchants, soldiers, sure. But you also had tens of thousands of people from the Philippines and other parts of Asia.
Tens of thousands.
Many of them enslaved or coerced laborers. Some estimates go as high as 100,000 people over those 2.5 centuries. 100,000 people from Southeast Asia arriving directly on Mexico's Pacific coast. That is a massive demographic event.
It's huge. And the conditions were just awful. So what happened is, when they arrived in Acapulco, many of them just deserted.
They ran.
They ran. They vanished into the interior, settled along the coast, and they intermarried with the local indigenous populations and also with the European and African communities already there.
So the Spanish Empire basically created this accidental genetic superhighway.
That's a perfect way to put it. A direct and sustained flow of genes from Asia straight into the Americas.
Okay, so the history is there, but records can be, messy.
Right.
This is where the science comes in to give us the hard proof.
Right, and they looked exactly where you'd expect them to. The state of Guerrero, home to Acapulco. If the theory is right, the genetic signature has to be strongest there.
And what do they find?
The best data comes from a 2022 study, a really serious one. Researchers analyzed the genomes of Mexicans from Guerrero, and they found elevated Southeast Asian ancestry.
And they could trace it.
Oh, yeah. It specifically matched non-Negrito, Filipino, and Western Indonesian sources.
Hold on, I want to pause on that.
Yeah.
Non-Negrito Filipino. Why is that specific distinction so important?
It's all about precision. They specify non-Negrito to track ancestry from the dominant Austronesian-speaking populations.
Okay.
Those were the major seafaring and trading groups who would have been caught up in the galleon trade. It helps separate that historical DNA from the much older signatures of other indigenous groups in the Philippines.
Got it. So it pinpoints the ancestry directly to the colonial period.
Exactly. And here's the most amazing part, the dating.
Right. They didn't just find the DNA, they could tell when the mixing happened.
This is the absolute smoking gun.
Yeah.
They dated the admixture event to around 1620 CE.
1620.
It perfectly aligns with the peak of the Manila galleon trade.
So it proves the genetic signature was established almost immediately after the route got going. It wasn't a slow trickle.
No, it suggests a large, sudden influx of Asian people right from the early days. It's scientific validation of the entire history.
And what about the numbers? How much of this DNA are we actually talking about in Guerrero today?
This is where it gets really profound. In that region, some individuals show up to 10% Asian ancestry.
10%.
10%, directly traceable to the Philippines. And about a third of all the people they sampled there carry these genetic markers.
A third of the population.
That is.
That's huge. I mean, when we think about modern Mexico, we think indigenous, European, African roots. This is basically confirming a fourth major root.
A fourth root that was, for a long time, suppressed. The historical records called this group Chino, simply a person from Asia.
And the colonial system, the casta system, was all about racial hierarchy. How did that affect them?
Well, being a Chino came with restrictions, higher taxes, less freedom of movement. So to get around that, many Asian migrants were misclassified or they presented themselves as Indios Native Americans.
So they assimilated legally to survive.
They did. It masked the demographic history, but it couldn't erase the genetic imprint.
And the culture, remember, too. You mentioned some cultural echoes.
Absolutely. The word Parian. It's still used on the Pacific coast of Mexico for a market.
And that's from the Philippines.
Directly. From the Filipino word for the Chinese Quarter in Manila. And even better, there's tuba.
The coconut wine.
The coconut wine.
Yeah.
That entire distillation technique was brought over by Filipino laborers. It's a living artifact from the galleon era right there on the Mexican coast.
That is just incredible. Okay, so let's flip the script. We've established this massive Asian flow into Mexico. What about the other way? What traces did Mexico leave in the Philippines?
It was definitely a two-way street, just on a different scale. The Spanish needed people from New Spain to run the Philippines.
Soldiers, administrators.
Exactly. And these weren't just pure-blooded Spaniards from Europe. They were people from Mexico, from Peru, who were already a mix of European, Native American, and African ancestry.
So they were bringing that whole complex American gene pool with them.
Precisely. Historical estimates say around 15,600 Latin American settlers arrived just in the 1600s.
And we can measure that today.
We can. If you look at something like the National Geographic Genographic Project, they found modern Filipinos have, on average, about 2% Native American ancestry and 5% Southern European.
And that's what people see on their commercial DNA tests sometimes, right?
Absolutely. If you're Filipino and you take a 23andMe test, you might see a small percentage, maybe up to 5%, of indigenous American DNA. That's a direct echo of those Mexican soldiers and settlers.
So the impact was subtler. It was an echo, like you said, not a foundational shift like we saw in Guerrero.
That's the key. The sheer volume was so different. The flow from New Spain blended into the existing Filipino tapestry rather than redefining it.
So if we zoom out from the genetics for a second, this galleon route was exchanging more than just people.
Oh, is a massive exchange of culture. Crops, ideas, traditions.
What were some of the big ones? What did Mexico send to Asia?
It completely revolutionized their cuisine. Mexico sent corn, tomatoes, and this is the big one, chili peppers.
Wow. You can't imagine Thai food or Szechuan food without chilies.
And they came from the Americas. In return, the Philippines sent mango varieties, coconuts, and those distillation techniques we talked about.
And you could even see it in the food games. Mexican adobo and Filipino adobo. They share a root in the same Spanish curing techniques that crossed the ocean.
Even if the dishes are totally different today, the history is there.
So before we wrap up, let's go back to the science for a second. How do they actually date that admixture event to 1620? It seems like magic.
It's incredibly clever. It's all about bioinformatics. They use software to look at a person's genome and figure out the recipe of their ancestry by comparing it to reference populations.
Okay, that finds the origin, but how do they get the date?
That's the elegant part. It's all about the length of the DNA segment.
The length?
Yeah. So when two people from different populations first have a child, the segments of DNA they pass on from each side are long and unbroken.
Makes sense.
But with each new generation, those segments get broken up and become shorter and shorter through recombination.
I see.
So by measuring how short the Filipino DNA segments are in a Mexican individual today, they can calculate how many generations have passed since that first mixing event.
And the math pointed directly to the 17th century.
Right to the peak of the galleon trade. It's a powerful way to prove that what we see in old shipping logs is a hard biological truth.
That is genuinely amazing. Okay, so let's bring this all home. The main takeaway is pretty clear.
It is.
The primary flow was Southeast Asian, mostly Filipino, ancestry into coastal Mexico.
Mhm.
It created this huge, measurable legacy there.
And while the reverse flow left subtler traces in the Philippines, the Spanish Empire basically wove this incredible genetic tapestry across the Pacific completely by accident.
Yeah.
It just highlights these big themes in human history,
Yeah.
how empires create these migration paths and how communities just blend and adapt and carry that proof in their biology.
Which leaves a really interesting question for you, the listener, to think that this is about identity, right?
Mm.
The historical suppression of that Asian Chino identity in Mexico. It was done centuries ago for legal and social reasons. But now, science is reversing that.
The DNA is bringing it back into the light.
The very DNA that carries the history is now confirming this vital, forgotten pillar of Mexican heritage. And that's something to think about the next time you look at a map or your own family tree and realize just how connected we all really are.